Hello and welcome to Bharat Shakti.in. I'm Brigadier Chatterjee, and we'll be talking about Ukraine war once again today. Uh, we've had this war started by the Russians, and now a stage has come when Russians have fallen back on the defensive. If that itself is any measure of the way the battle has gone, it's definitely Ukraine having achieved much more than was perhaps expected of them initially. But what is the status right now, and how will it possibly progress hereafter? That's the issue that I'm going to delve into. And I have with me an officer from the Austrian Army, Colonel Marcus Weisner, who commands a very prestigious battalion of the Austrian Army. He's the man who's going to take us through it. Welcome to the show, Colonel.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward into your questions.
We are looking forward to your ideas about this war because we have a lot of specialists who come and talk on our website. But that's more the Indian viewpoint. But let's get a viewpoint from some other continent. And well, I think nobody fits the bill better than you do. Well, my first question is I take off from what I started with my introduction with. The Russians started the offensive and they've now fallen back on the defensive. By itself, it's a very major achievement for the Ukrainians. But how do you rate the Russian defensive positions now? I believe they're very well built and they have strengthened them, and well, they will require very deliberate effort to be breached.
Okay, so this is a very important question. I would like to start with a short introduction into the general situation, and it's important to note that after 16 months of war, we can have already some clear assessments. And one of the clear assessments what we can have is that whenever the Ukrainians were able to become mobile, that means when were able to fight a mobile war, it was the case that the Russians were suffering from their doctrine and other things like material, officers, moral, and so on and so on. But whenever the Russian armed forces were able to start or to force the Ukrainians in a positional warfare, then the success was on their side. And we have seen this several times. So if you remember the battle for Lysychansk and Severodonetsk last year in summer, after the breakthrough at Popasna, that was the moment when the Russians changed their tactic and when the Russians forced a positional warfare onto the Ukrainians. And the same we have seen also in Bakhmut, for example. And now it's important to understand that actually last year there were 3 offensives planned already from the Ukrainian side. It was Kharkiv, Kherson, and already at that time it was planned to do also an offensive at the north of Melitopol. But it never took place because with the troops, the Russians were able to evacuate from Kherson. They put so much pressure on the Ukrainians in Bakhmut that the Ukrainians were forced to the Bakhmut region. And they needed more time to prepare themselves for the offensive, what we do see at the moment. But now it comes to the point. Now we have already day 16 after the start of the offensive, and still the Ukrainians have not gained any significant breakthrough. And this is a harsh situation because, again, it shows that the Russians obviously were preparing themselves in the last 6 months in a very appropriate way. And it's clear that as long as the Russians are still forcing the Ukrainians to fight a positional war, and that's what they do at the moment, they can attrit them very much. And this is the problem, because the Ukrainians are now sending wave after wave against these defense lines, and the attrition rate is very high. And the most important thing is that this already have started in the so-called combat outpost line. So we are not even at the main defense line of 3 defense lines in the rear of the central area of the Russian armed forces. And this is the problem. So the problem is positional war means an advantage for the Russians, and what they have prepared, they had a lot of time to do so. The last 6 months, they did it in that way.
All right, thank you. I'll get on to the next issue. According to reports that we have over here, there are good about 12 brigades that the Ukrainians have, which are properly trained and which are properly equipped, and which are possibly going to be launched in this counter-offensive of theirs. I'm not aware how much of it has been launched already, but they would still have some more troops other than these 12 brigades, of course. Now, what is your assessment of the state of equipment, state of manpower, state of morale? How do you rate them? Because it's going to be a hard battle, like you've already defined.
Okay, first of all, also here, let's start with a short introduction. So I'm very often compared this war with the First World War. Why? Because in 1914, everyone thought that this war will end in a quite short time. Then in 1915, like it was nearly 100 years ago, it was more or less clear that all the plans which were made in 1914 will not work. And 1915 was also the year when the most of the elite forces were pretty much already killed or at least wounded. So when the reservists jump in, more or less. So one of the things we have to consider always when you talk about numbers is, of course, the quality of these soldiers, not only the quantity. From the quantity, we know that just recently the commander of the US forces in Europe, General Cavioli, said that it's estimated from the US side that the Russians have about 350 to 400,000 soldiers available for the operations in Ukraine. We can also estimate that pretty much the same number of forces is valid on the Ukrainian side. But again, a huge amount of those forces on both sides are already reservists. And of course, the quality of the reservists you cannot compare to the elite forces who fought at the beginning of the year, especially last year. Now let's talk about strategic reserves. And strategic reserves means for Ukraine that they prepared 12 brigades. 9 of these brigades were equipped by Western states, and 3 brigades were equipped on their own. At the moment, we see parts of those brigades involved in the offensive. I would say 1/3 of them, but there are still 2/3 of these brigades available. Also here we have to make sure that we have a clear understanding about the equipment. An average tank battalion of these brigades consists of 3 line companies and a small command element. So that means altogether it's about 31 tanks, which is quite a low number. And also the same with the grenadier battalions, because an average brigade has about 2 up to 3 grenadier battalions and one of these tank battalions and 1 artillery battalion. But all over, it's not a huge number. So that's been between 3,500 and 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers, I would say. There are some elite units like the 47s and the 82nds, but overall the numbers are low. And this is the case because Solushny said a couple of months ago, I need another 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and another 500 artillery pieces to fill these future 12 brigades to go into the offensive again. Well, the situation is at the moment that they used 1/3 of these brigades in the counteroffensive, but they had high losses. And what they do at the moment is they try to come up with some kind of an operational pause to readjust and to try once again. So we will see if after this readjustment, the next attack will be more successful like the one we have seen just recently.
Right. The Ukrainians must have revised their objectives, etc. After having gone through a part of this battle already, like you described to us. It's very difficult to break the crust of prepared defenses. I understand that. But what would you say will be their objectives now, the strategic objectives, the operational objectives? What would be the objectives of the Ukrainians at this stage?
Well, it's a very good question. And if you have time, maybe you share the link of one of my last YouTube videos, because I try to explain it a little bit to the audience, what is their operational and strategic objective. The operational objective is to have one decisive attack in direction of the so-called Azov Sea. Why? Because if that would be successful, then the Russian occupied territories would be divided in 2 parts. The one part, which pretty much covers Luhansk and Donetsk, so the northeast of the front line, and the other side, which covers the southwest, which would be then Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Crimea. And the situation in the southeast would be very tense because there are only 2 lines of communication which are useful and which are necessary to supply the troops in the southeast. And this is, of course, the land line, especially the railway line from the north of Mariupol down to the Crimea. And of course, it's the line which goes over the so-called bridge over the Strait of Kerch. So when the Ukrainians would be able to cut off these 2 lines of communication, the one by just attacking in direction of the Azov Sea and the other one maybe with another attack like we have seen in the past, then the Russian forces on Crimea, Zaporozhye, and Kherson would be operational isolated. So the strategic goal would then be achievable to force them to go to the negotiation table and to negotiate at least armistice or maybe some kind of trust in favor of the Ukrainians.
Would you like to also add a little bit about the kind of tactics the Ukrainians are utilizing and what is the exact status of the front now? if that information is available with you?
Also, this is a very important question, and I'm one of the persons who said for months already we should not underestimate the Russians and we should not overestimate the Ukrainians. I would even say if we always underestimate the Russians, we are actually giving the Ukrainians a very hard time and a very hard burden, because we have to clearly understand what the Ukrainians need to make sure that the Ukrainians will get what they actually need on the front lines. So when you look at war fighting, then you know that war fighting is done in different domains. So there is the land domain, there is the air domain, there is the maritime domain, then of course we have space, we have the information domain, we have the cyber domain. And if you compare both sides, then you can say very clearly that there are advantages in different domains for each side. But there is one thing which absolutely is obvious, and this is the fact that Ukraine has no functional, potent air force anymore. Of course, they have some fighter planes, they have some planes which they have re-engineered and rebuilt in a way that they can also carry Western systems like the Storm Shadow rocket. But the problem is there is no mass. Just imagine a D-Day situation like it was in 1944 without the preparation of the Allied air forces of the German lines, and of course the fact that on the day of the landing the Allied air forces were able to interdict especially the reserves from the Germans which were going into direction of the beaches. So what we see at the moment is that the Ukrainians try to conduct an offensive without having those air domain in a sufficient way available, and this is the problem. And especially during the first attacks, we have seen that when the Ukrainian elements were actually the lines of departure, those columns were already attacked by the Russian Air Force, by the Russian close support elements, by the Russian attack helicopters, and that means that just before the battle actually started, after departing the line of departure, they were already destroyed from the Ukrainian, from the Russian side. And this shows very clearly that the Russians have adapted the last months, and that they still have a lot of assets, and they have synchronized those assets against the Ukrainians, and that was more or less the result what we have seen in the last 2 days, in the last 2 weeks actually.
Right, we'll go a little away from this mainline battle story, and I'm going to refer to the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group has been pretty extensively perhaps used by the Russians in this particular war, and they have performed well also. Can you tell us about a little bit of the employment of the Wagner Group by the Russians?
Well, there are two important things. We have to see Wagner always in two different directions. The one is the regional role Wagner has, especially in Ukraine, and the other one is the global role, what Wagner has, for example, in Africa, in the Sahel and in Northern Africa. Let's talk about the regional role. Here you have to understand, and I know this is a very harsh assessment, but you have also to understand a little bit the culture of the Russian side, that those Wagner, especially those prisoners which were used by Wagner, they are pretty much like meat. So this meat was used by the Russians to trigger what I call the Ukrainian tiger. So the tiger was going for that meat, but the Russian hunters in the rear, they were actually be able then to shoot at the tiger, at the Ukrainian one, and killing them. So that means those losses from Wagner were intended in a way to force the Ukrainians to send in their reserves and to make sure that the Russians, by using their strongest weapon, and this is still the artillery, to treat those forces which were incoming. Now, this is why I compared this situation with the meat, the tiger, and the hunter, for example. So this is the regional role. The global role is also very important. I guess you know this very famous game Risk. So you have little toy soldiers and you play by just trying to invade or occupy different countries. And while we all look into Ukraine and what Wagner is doing there, we very often forget that there is also some kind of global competition ongoing, and that in that time we lost several countries in Africa, for example, because Northern Africa, and especially the Sahel, if you look at Mali, Burkina Faso, and other states, Central Africa, for example, has fallen to the Russians. And why? Because they used Wagner to project force there. So there are actually two very important roles Wagner has in this conflict. what I call is not a regional conflict anymore. It's a conflict already by the global south against the global north.
Okay. A little more about Wagner, if you like. Well, you see, there's a lot of cohesion that we have witnessed as far as the employment of Wagner by the Russians is concerned. But of late, the leadership on both parts have been critical about each other, the defense leadership of the Russians and also Wagner Group leadership. So, is this going to affect their employment? How do you see this playing out ahead?
Well, there is a very old tradition in the Russian culture, and this tradition is related to deception. There is a Russian word, it's called mashkirovka. That means to show something to the other and to make them think that the situation like it is, but in reality the situation is completely different. So whenever we see some things from the other side of the hill, we always have to consider also that this is already mashkirovka. So one of the interesting things is that, for example, when Prigozhin said that he has not enough ammunition and also not the special weapon systems he needs in Bakhmut, actually this was not correct, because he had those special weapon systems like, for example, TOS-1 flamethrowers, and they also had ammunition to conduct their strikes in Bakhmut. But actually that was a message especially to the West. And especially you have always to consider that the information domain is also a very important domain, and it's always about dominating this information domain, to give the other side an idea and let them think what they think is the right thing, but try to make it completely different. And the other aspect, which I think is also important, is also related a little bit to the strategic culture. Of course, we can discuss this, but I just would like to give you an idea how it could be. In the Tsaristic times, it was always very important for the Tsar that the boyars, who were the ones who were ruling directly under him, were always kept busy, because as long as the boyars were fighting each other, no one was actually fighting against the Tsar. So very likely this is also part of the truth, that Putin tries to make sure that there are different factions under him and they are busy with each other, so no one is busy actually with Putin. So this is one of the things you always have to consider here. So always try to make a look behind the curtain to understand actually what's going on. And don't think all the things we are seeing on television and what are presented to us are reality, because again, the information domain is one of the most important domains. I give you one example. There was the fall of Bakhmut, and the Russians tried to make out a big thing of it, like they did in Mariupol just 1 year earlier. But no one was talking about the victory at Bakhmut from the Russian side. Everyone was talking about things which happened immediately afterwards, and that was the attacks from the Ukrainian side on Russian territory. And you can see here very detailed and very clear that the Ukrainians fought very clever, because they changed immediately, they shaped immediately the information domain. No one was talking about Bakhmut anymore. Everyone was talking about the Russians who are incompetent and not able to control the border regions. So you understand that there is always something behind, actually.
Right. Now let's get back to NATO and its relationship with Ukraine war specifically. NATO is one set of countries, I would say. You've seen a lot of privations because of this war. Well, your prices have gone up and living costs have gone up. Everything is going up. Well, how long do you see? And if you see the Russian side and the Russian-Ukraine battle as of now, like you yourself said, it will be very difficult to break through this prepared defenses and then go in for a biggest victory, which will be decisive. How long do you see NATO still supporting Ukraine under these circumstances?
Well, again, you have to understand Austria is not a NATO member. Austria is a member of the so-called NATO Partnership for Peace process. So I don't want to actually speak here on behalf of NATO. I just can tell you that at the moment, most of the NATO countries give a clear impression that they will go on to assist Ukraine as long it is possible. But they want to avoid to be part of this war in a way of a direct involvement. So it's still ruled out that there are any NATO forces involved directly on the fights on the ground in a significant amount of troops, for example. It's still ruled out that there is a situation where, for example, fighter planes are starting in NATO countries to bomb targets, to bomb Russian targets in occupied Ukrainian territories. So on the one side, they try to assist Ukraine. Why? Because, as you know, there is the NATO term center of gravity, or even the term which is used in the US military. The center of gravity describes that very important part, which you really have to make sure that it survives if you would like to win a war. And for the Ukrainians, this is the assistance of the West. As long as this center of gravity exists, the Ukrainians are able to fight, to go on and fight this war. If it ceases, then immediately the war will stop. On the other side, of course, the center of gravity for the Russian side, in my opinion, is the cohesion of the people. As long as they are close to the regime, as long as they are able to assist the regime, as long as they're producing soldiers, this will just go on, and the fight will go on. So at the moment, it looks like that NATO is still convinced that they can, on the long term, force Russia to step back and to return to the situation like it was before. Of course, the offensive at the moment, what we see here, is something like what I call a culmination point. You should not forget that there is the NATO summit in Vilnius in the mid of July, from the 11th to the 13th. And of course, a lot of questions will be asked there also to the Ukrainians. The question is, okay, what's going on with your offensive? Is there a success or not? And so on and so on. Yeah? I only can tell you that the historians, they will tell you in 5 to 10 years that it was very clear and completely understandable that it then finally developed in that or in that direction. At the moment, we cannot say for sure how this situation will develop. It will depend on the will of the NATO states to assist Ukraine, of course, and it will also depend on the other side, on the Russian people, when it comes to the point to assist Putin and the state.
All right, Colonel, let's call off the discussion on that note. Thank you so much. I think it was very well explained, all the details about the various aspects that I had shown up for you to comment upon. Thank you so much for sparing your time for BharatShakti.in.
Thanks, and all the best to New Delhi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks, viewers. Thanks for tuning in to BharatShakti.in. Do tune in now and then, and you will find such interesting stories. Also visit our social media pages. Thank you.